The winter of 1942 brought more than just snow to the mountains of northern Iran. It brought hope in the most unexpected form. Lieutenant Anatol Tarnowiecki stood at the edge of the refugee camp watching Polish soldiers who had escaped Soviet labor camps gather around a fire. These men had survived the impossible, walking thousands of kilometers through unforgiving terrain, driven by a single purpose: to fight again. The air smelled of wood smoke and desperation, but there was something else that morning, something that would change everything for the 22nd Artillery Supply Company. The camp itself was a collection of tattered tents and makeshift shelters scattered across a barren hillside near Hamadan. Snow dusted the peaks surrounding them, and the wind carried a biting cold that reminded the soldiers of Siberia, of the labor camps they had barely escaped. These men were ghosts of their former selves, their bodies weakened by months of starvation and forced labor, their minds haunted by memories of friends who had not survived. They had been Polish army officers, teachers, engineers, farmers, all arrested by Soviet forces after the invasion of Poland in 1939. They had been sent to gulags in Kazakhstan and Siberia, where thousands died from cold, hunger, and disease. Only the German invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 had saved them, forcing Stalin to release Polish prisoners so they could form an army to fight against the common enemy. A young Iranian boy approached the camp, no older than 12, clutching a wriggling bundle wrapped in torn cloth. His feet were bare despite the cold, his clothes little more than rags. He moved with the careful wariness of someone who had learned that strangers could be dangerous. Inside the bundle was a bear cub, barely 8 weeks old, its mother killed by hunters who had sold the meat in the local market. The boy had found the cub alone in the mountains, crying beside its dead mother, and he had carried it down hoping to trade it for something to eat. His own family was starving, displaced by the chaos of war that had turned the entire region into a crossroads of armies and refugees. The boy's eyes held the kind of sadness that war creates, ancient beyond his years, and when he offered the cub to the soldiers in exchange for food, nobody could have predicted that this creature would become a symbol of resilience for an entire army. If you're enjoying this story of courage and unlikely friendship, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more incredible true stories from history. Private Pyotr Prendis was the first to hold the cub. His hands, calloused from months of hard labor in Siberian camps, trembled as he felt the warmth of new life against his chest. The bear made small, whimpering sounds, hungry and confused. Around him, other soldiers gathered, their weathered faces softening. These were men who had seen their homeland invaded, their families torn apart, their friends die in frozen wastelands. They had every reason to be hard, to be cruel, to trust nothing. But something about this helpless creature broke through their armor. Sergeant Dmitry Salugo knelt down, his voice rough but gentle as he spoke in Polish. "The bear cannot stay here without a name. We must call him something." Someone suggested Wojtek, a diminutive of Wojciech, a common Polish name meaning one who enjoys war or happy warrior. The irony was not lost on anyone. Here was a creature that knew nothing of human conflict, thrust into the middle of the greatest war in history. They decided then that Wojtek would not just be a mascot, he would be one of them. The days that followed tested every man's patience and ingenuity. Bear cubs require constant care, and these soldiers had barely enough supplies to sustain themselves. But they improvised with the resourcefulness that had kept them alive through Soviet captivity. They fashioned a makeshift bottle from an old vodka container, mixing condensed milk with water. Wojtek drank eagerly, his small paws batting at the bottle. He grew stronger each day, and with that strength came personality. He was curious about everything, poking his nose into tents, investigating cooking pots, stealing caps from unsuspecting soldiers. His antics provided something the men desperately needed: laughter. In a world defined by loss and uncertainty, this bear cub reminded them that joy still existed. The bond between Wojtek and the soldiers deepened through countless small moments. Private Jan Bielik, who had lost 3 brothers in the Soviet camps, would spend his evenings teaching the cub simple tricks. He used pieces of dried fruit as rewards, patiently showing Wojtek how to sit, how to offer his paw, how to stand on command. The bear learned quickly, his intelligence surprising everyone. Within weeks, he understood Polish commands better than some of the Iranian recruits who had joined the unit. Sergeant Salugo constructed a wooden crate lined with old blankets to serve as Wojtek's bed, placing it near the fire where the bear could stay warm through cold mountain nights. The cub would curl up in his box, making small, contented sounds, surrounded by men who took turns keeping watch to ensure he was safe. Feeding Wojtek became a collective responsibility. Every soldier contributed something from his own meager rations. Condensed milk was supplemented with honey when they could acquire it, with mashed vegetables, with small amounts of meat. The cub's appetite was prodigious, and there were debates about whether they could continue to sustain him as he grew. but nobody seriously suggested giving him away. Lieutenant Tarnowiecki noticed something remarkable happening in his unit. Men who had been withdrawn, traumatized by their experiences in the gulags, began to talk more, to smile occasionally, to engage with each other. The bear gave them a shared purpose beyond mere survival. They were not just soldiers anymore, they were caretakers, protectors of something innocent and vulnerable. In caring for Wojtek, they reconnected with parts of themselves they thought the war had destroyed. As winter gave way to spring in 1943, the Polish forces prepared to leave Iran and travel to British-controlled territories in the Middle East. The journey would take them through Iraq and into Palestine, where they would undergo intensive training before being deployed to the Italian front. British military officials, however, presented an unexpected obstacle. Animals were not permitted on troop transports. The rule was absolute, designed to prevent logistical complications and health hazards. Lieutenant Tarnowiecki spent an entire afternoon in heated discussion with the British quartermaster, a stout man with a thick mustache and an unwavering adherence to regulations. "But we cannot leave him behind," Tarnowiecki insisted, his English heavily accented but determined. The quartermaster remained unmoved until someone suggested a solution both absurd and brilliant. They would officially enlist Wojtek in the Polish army. The paperwork was completed with a strange mix of bureaucratic seriousness and barely suppressed amusement. Wojtek was assigned a serial number, a rank of private, and a paybook. He became, according to official military records, a soldier in the 22nd Artillery Supply Company. The British officials stamped the documents with expressions that suggested they thought the Poles had gone mad. But regulations were regulations. If the bear was a soldier, he could travel with his unit. Private Wojtek boarded the transport ship in Khorramshahr, carried up the gangplank by soldiers who treated him like a precious cargo. He seemed unbothered by the attention, more interested in the interesting smells coming from the ship's galley. The voyage across the Persian Gulf and into the Mediterranean was Wojtek's first real test of military life. The close quarters of a troop ship, packed with thousands of soldiers, equipment, and supplies, would have been overwhelming for any animal. But Wojtek adapted with remarkable ease. He established his territory in a corner of the hold where his company was billeted, and he quickly learned the ship's routines. He discovered that the galley produced food at specific times, and that certain soldiers were more generous with scraps than others. Corporal Henryk Zakharevich became his primary caretaker, a quiet man from Krakow who had lost his entire family in the first months of the war. Henryk spoke to Wojtek constantly, telling him stories about Poland, about the Tatra Mountains, about the Vistula River flowing through Warsaw. The bear would sit and listen, his head tilted as if he understood every word. Perhaps, in his own way, he did. Palestine provided the Polish forces with time to regroup, retrain, and rebuild their strength. The base near Gaza became temporary home to thousands of soldiers, and Wojtek thrived in this environment. He was no longer a small cub, but a growing adolescent bear, standing nearly 5 feet tall when on his hind legs. His personality had fully emerged, and it was far more complex than anyone had anticipated. He enjoyed wrestling with soldiers who were brave enough to engage him, though he always seemed to know when to hold back his true strength. He learned to salute when approached by officers, raising his right paw to his head in a gesture that was both comical and strangely dignified. He developed a taste for beer, which the soldiers rationed carefully, allowing him only occasional sips. He became addicted to cigarettes, though he never lit them himself, instead eating them or holding them in his mouth like the soldiers around him. The training grounds at Gaza became Wojtek's playground and classroom. British officers who visited the Polish camp were invariably shocked to see a bear participating in morning formations, standing among the soldiers as roll call was conducted. The bear had learned the routine completely, understanding when to stand at attention, when to move, when to rest. He accompanied supply details, watching as men loaded and unloaded crates from trucks. He seemed particularly fascinated by heavy objects being moved, often approaching to investigate or attempt to help. This instinct would prove crucial later, though nobody realized it at the time. The Palestinian sun was brutal during summer months, temperatures rising above 40 degrees Celsius. Wojtek learned to seek shade during the hottest hours, lying beneath trucks or in the shadow of buildings. Soldiers rigged a canvas awning specifically for him, creating a sheltered area where he could rest. They also discovered that he loved water, and they would take him to the beach on off-duty days. The sight of a bear playing in the Mediterranean surf became oddly normal to the Polish troops, though it never failed to astonish British and American soldiers stationed nearby. Wojtek would wade into the waves, splashing and rolling in the water, clearly delighted by the sensation. These beach excursions became treasured memories, moments of peace, stolen from the machinery of war. Training intensified as summer turned to autumn. The Polish Second Corps practiced combined arms tactics, preparing for the mountain warfare they would face in Italy. Artillery crews drilled endlessly, learning to set up and displace quickly, to calculate firing solutions under pressure, to work as cohesive units under fire. The 22nd Artillery Supply Company trained alongside them, practicing the unglamorous but vital work of keeping ammunition flowing to the guns. They rehearsed loading drills, convoy procedures, emergency resupply under simulated combat conditions. Wojtek participated in many of these exercises, his presence now so normalized that commanders included him in planning. If the Bear was going to Italy, and everyone assumed he was, then he needed to be accustomed to the chaos and noise of combat. But Wojtek's most remarkable quality was his ability to sense the emotional state of the men. When a soldier received bad news from home, letters that arrived months late bearing information about deaths or disappearances, Wojtek would approach quietly and sit beside him. He would rest his massive head against the soldier's leg, offering a comfort that transcended language or species. Sergeant Antoni Przybyłak watched this happen repeatedly and came to believe that the Bear understood loss in a way that made him perfect for this company of broken men. "We are all orphans here," Antoni said one evening as Wojtek dozed in the warm Palestinian sun. "The Bear, the soldiers, all of us, we lost our families, our country, everything. Maybe that is why he fits so perfectly among us." The autumn of 1943 brought orders that would test everything Wojtek had learned. The Polish Second Corps, under the command of General Władysław Anders, would deploy to Italy to join the Allied Italian campaign. Their objective was clear but daunting: break through the German defensive positions in the mountainous terrain south of Rome. The most formidable obstacle was Monte Cassino, an ancient monastery perched atop a steep mountain that dominated the valley below. German forces had transformed the position into a fortress, and previous Allied attempts to capture it had failed with devastating casualties. The Poles would make the fourth and final assault, and every soldier knew that many of them would not survive. The transport to Italy was somber. Men wrote final letters home, checked their equipment repeatedly, and spoke in hushed tones about what awaited them. Wojtek seemed to sense the change in atmosphere. He stayed close to his company, his playful behavior subdued. When the ships arrived at the port of Taranto in southern Italy, the Bear followed his unit down the gangplank and into a country ravaged by years of warfare. The Italian countryside showed scars everywhere: bombed-out villages, cratered roads, refugees streaming along highways with all their possessions piled onto carts. The Polish forces moved north toward the front lines, and with each kilometer, the sounds of war grew louder. Monte Cassino dominated the landscape like a fortress from another age. The monastery itself sat at an elevation of over 500 meters, its thick walls visible from kilometers away. The Germans had fortified not just the monastery, but the entire mountainside, creating overlapping fields of fire that made any approach suicidal. The Rapido River ran through the valley below, turned into a killing zone by mines, barbed wire, and machine gun positions. Previous attacks by American, British, New Zealand, and Indian forces had all been repulsed with horrific losses. Now it was the Poles' turn. Lieutenant Tarnowiecki gathered his men in a ruined farmhouse on the evening of May 11th, 1944. He spoke plainly about what they faced. "Tomorrow night, we attack. Our objective is to supply the frontline troops with ammunition, no matter what. If we fail, the assault fails. If the assault fails, more men die. Everything depends on us doing our job." He paused, looking at the faces around him, then added something unexpected. "Wojtek comes with us." There was a moment of stunned silence. Taking a Bear into combat seemed insane, but then again, so much of what they had survived seemed impossible. Corporal Zakariewicz stood up, his voice steady. "He is one of us. He has earned the right to be there." Others nodded in agreement. Wojtek had been with them through everything, through the camps, through the exodus, through the training. He was not just a mascot or a pet. He was a soldier in their company, and soldiers stood together. The assault on Monte Cassino began at 11 o'clock on the night of May 11th with an artillery barrage that lit up the sky. Polish forces moved forward in darkness, scrambling up steep slopes, while German machine guns raked their positions. The 22nd Artillery Supply Company established themselves at a forward position near the base of the mountain, responsible for maintaining the flow of ammunition to the artillery batteries higher up. The work was backbreaking and deadly. Artillery shells weighing over 40 pounds each had to be unloaded from trucks, carried through treacherous terrain, and delivered to gun positions under constant fire. Men worked in teams, passing shells in human chains, running bent over to present smaller targets. The German response was immediate and brutal. Counter-battery fire rained down, turning the supply route into a nightmare of explosions and flying shrapnel. The first hours of the battle were chaos incarnate. The darkness was broken only by muzzle flashes and explosions, creating a hellscape of light and shadow. The ground shook continuously from artillery impacts, the air filled with smoke so thick that men could barely see 3 meters ahead. Communication broke down as radio equipment was damaged by shell fragments. Supply trucks struggled along cratered roads, their drivers navigating by instinct and luck. Men died in the darkness, torn apart by shrapnel, crushed by falling rocks, killed by direct hits from German mortars. Medical orderlies moved through the carnage, trying to evacuate wounded while under fire, the screams of injured soldiers mixed with the roar of explosions, creating a symphony of horror. Wojtek watched the first few shells being unloaded, his expression puzzled by the chaos around him. The noise was overwhelming, far worse than anything he had experienced during training exercises. Lesser animals would have fled in terror, but Wojtek had been raised by soldiers, had lived his entire life in military camps, had absorbed something of their discipline and courage. Then something extraordinary happened. He approached the nearest soldier, Private Mikhail Kowalski, who was struggling with a heavy crate of ammunition, his hands bleeding from handling rough wood under pressure. Without any command or prompting, Wojtek grabbed the crate in his powerful arms. He stood upright on his hind legs, holding the ammunition against his chest the way the soldiers did, and carried it toward the gun position 50 meters away. For a moment, everyone stopped and stared. Even in the midst of battle, the sight was so unexpected that men paused in their work. Then Corporal Zakariewicz shouted over the noise, his voice cutting through the explosions. "Keep moving! The bear has the right idea." What followed was perhaps the most surreal scene in the entire Italian campaign. Wojtek, a brown bear weighing over 400 pounds, became an ammunition porter. He worked alongside the soldiers, carrying crates and loose shells with an efficiency that exceeded human capability. His strength was phenomenal. Where two men struggled with a crate, Wojtek carried it alone. Where soldiers had to pause and rest after multiple trips, the bear worked tirelessly, moving back and forth between supply dump and gun position without stopping. He never flinched at the explosions, never hesitated when artillery fire came close. German shells landed within meters of him, showering him with dirt and rock fragments, but he simply shook himself and continued working. His fur became matted with dust and powder residue, turning him gray in the darkness. Blood from minor cuts marked his paws where sharp rocks had torn skin, but he ignored the pain. He simply worked back and forth, supply truck to gun position over and over. The soldiers around him drew strength from his presence. If a bear could face this hell without fear, then so could they. Private Kowalski later said that watching Wojtek work was the most inspiring thing he had ever witnessed, more powerful than any speech or order. The bear's courage was pure, instinctive, uncomplicated by fear or doubt. As dawn broke on May 12th, the intensity of fighting increased. German forces could now see Polish positions and directed accurate fire against them. The supply route became even more dangerous, exposed to observation and direct targeting. Several trucks were destroyed, their drivers killed at the wheels. The artillery batteries were depleting ammunition faster than it could be replaced, and without a steady supply, the Polish assault would fail. The company worked frantically, knowing that men were dying higher up the mountain, that their friends needed these shells to survive. Wojtek increased his pace, sensing somehow that the urgency was greater. He made trip after trip, carrying shells that enabled Polish guns to keep firing, to suppress German machine gun nests, to destroy fortified positions blocking the advance. The battle for Monte Cassino raged for 7 days. The Polish forces fought with a desperation born from years of oppression and exile. They were not just fighting for Allied victory, they were fighting for Poland itself, for a country that had been erased from the map, for families they might never see again. Every meter of ground was purchased with blood. The slopes of Monte Cassino became littered with the dead and wounded, but the Poles kept pushing forward. The 22nd Artillery Supply Company worked without rest, and Wojtek worked with them. Soldiers later reported that the bear carried hundreds of shells during the battle, perhaps more than 1,000. He never dropped a single one. On the morning of May 18th, Polish troops finally reached the summit. They found the monastery in ruins, the German forces having withdrawn during the night rather than face complete encirclement. Corporal Emil Czech raised a Polish flag over the rubble, and across the battlefield, men who had fought for 7 days without sleep collapsed in exhaustion. The cost had been staggering. The Polish Second Corps suffered over 4,000 casualties, dead and wounded, but they had accomplished what 4 previous assaults could not. Monte Cassino had fallen. In the chaos and exhaustion that followed, someone noticed Wojtek sitting among the ruins, covered in dust and cordite residue, calmly eating a cigarette that someone had given him. The image was captured by a photographer, and it would become one of the most iconic photographs of the entire Italian campaign. The weeks after Monte Cassino brought a mixture of pride and profound grief. The Polish forces buried their dead in a military cemetery on the slopes they had fought so hard to capture. Each grave was marked with a simple white cross, row after row of them stretching across the hillside. Officers read names aloud during memorial services, and soldiers wept openly for friends who would never return to Poland. Wojtek attended these ceremonies, standing quietly at the edge of formations, his presence a reminder that even in the midst of death, Life persisted. General Anders himself visited the 22nd Artillery Supply Company to commend their performance. When he was told about the bear's contribution, he initially thought it was a joke. Then he saw the evidence, heard the testimonies from multiple soldiers, and understood that something remarkable had occurred. He ordered Wojtek promoted to the rank of corporal, and the bear's official unit insignia was changed to feature a bear carrying an artillery shell. The image was soon painted on trucks and equipment throughout the entire company, a symbol of their shared sacrifice. The Italian campaign continued through the summer and autumn of 1944. Corporal Wojtek and his unit pushed north, through battles at Ancona, Bologna, and beyond. The pattern established at Monte Cassino repeated itself at smaller scales. Wojtek helped with heavy lifting, boosted morale with his antics during quiet periods, and provided emotional support to soldiers dealing with trauma and loss. He had grown to his full adult size now, standing nearly 6 feet tall and weighing close to 500 pounds. He was a magnificent animal, powerful enough to be dangerous but gentle enough to be trusted. He understood commands in Polish, responded to his name, and had developed friendships with specific soldiers who looked after him. Corporal Zakariewicz remained his primary caretaker, and the bond between them had deepened into something profound. Zakariewicz told other soldiers that caring for Wojtek had given him a reason to survive. In keeping the bear safe, he had found a purpose beyond merely fighting and dying. Victory in Europe came in May 1945, but for the Polish soldiers, triumph was bittersweet. Poland had been liberated from Nazi occupation, but it had immediately fallen under Soviet control. The government in exile in London was not recognized by the Allies, and returning home meant facing a communist regime that viewed Anders' army as enemies rather than heroes. Most of the soldiers chose not to return. They became exiles for a second time, accepting offers of resettlement in Britain and other countries. The Polish Second Corps was transported to Scotland, where they would be officially disbanded. Wojtek made the journey with them, sailing across the Mediterranean and up the Atlantic coast to a country he had never seen, where the climate was cold and damp, where forests were different, and where nobody knew what to make of a bear that saluted. The demobilization process took months. Polish soldiers found themselves in a strange position, celebrated as war heroes, but essentially stateless. Britain offered citizenship, work opportunities, and assistance in building new lives, but nothing could replace what they had lost. Families were scattered across continents. Homes were occupied by strangers. Entire communities had been destroyed. The soldiers dealt with their grief in different ways. Some threw themselves into work, others into drink. Many simply carried their pain in silence, marked by experiences that British civilians could never fully understand. Through all of this, Wojtek remained a constant presence. The bear was housed at an abandoned farm near the town of Berwick upon Tweed in Northumberland, and soldiers visited him regularly. They would bring him treats, wrestle with him like old times, tell him stories in Polish that nobody else could understand. But practical realities eventually intruded. Maintaining a 500-pound bear required resources that the demobilized soldiers no longer had. The British military had been generous in allowing Wojtek to remain with his unit after the war, but that arrangement could not continue indefinitely. In 1947, after much debate and considerable heartache, the decision was made to transfer Wojtek to the Edinburgh Zoo. It was presented as a retirement, a place where he could live comfortably for the rest of his natural life. Corporal Zakariewicz argued against it, insisting that the bear belonged with soldiers, not behind bars. But even he had to admit that they could not provide what Wojtek needed. The bear was getting older, his playful energy diminishing, and he required proper veterinary care and a controlled diet. On a cold November morning, Wojtek was loaded into a truck for the last time. Soldiers from his old unit came to say goodbye, forming an honor guard as the vehicle departed. Some saluted. Others simply stood in silence, watching their friend disappear down the road. The Edinburgh Zoo provided Wojtek with a large enclosure designed to mimic natural bear habitat, but it could never replicate what he had lost. He was alone among bears, for the first time in his life, surrounded by other animals who had been born in captivity or captured in the wild. They did not share his history, his experiences, his connection to the men who had raised him. Zoo visitors came to see the famous soldier bear, the one featured in newspapers and magazine articles, but they saw only an animal behind bars. They could not see the soldier who had carried ammunition under fire, the companion who had comforted grieving men, the symbol of resilience who had given hope to an army of exiles. The transition to zoo life was difficult for Wojtek in ways that were heartbreaking to observe. In the first weeks, he would pace along the fence line for hours, clearly looking for something or someone. He refused to eat properly, losing weight at an alarming rate. Zoo veterinarians worried that he might be dying from depression, a condition they had seen in other animals removed from familiar environments. The zoo director, Thomas Gillespie, was a compassionate man who recognized that this was not an ordinary bear. He had read the newspaper accounts of Wojtek's service, understood what the animal represented to the Polish veterans, and he made arrangements to allow former soldiers greater access than normal visitors would receive. Former members of the 22nd Artillery Supply Company visited when they could, traveling from across Scotland and England to spend time with their old friend. These visits required coordination with work schedules, often involved long train journeys, and cost money that many veterans could barely afford. But they came anyway, driven by loyalty and love for the bear who had been their companion through the worst years of their lives. Wojtek always recognized them. His entire demeanor would change when he heard Polish being spoken, when he saw familiar faces approaching his enclosure. He would approach the bars immediately, stand upright, and raise his paw in that distinctive salute that had made him famous. Then he would press against the fence, trying to get closer, making soft sounds that expressed emotions the visitors could feel, even if they could not fully understand them. The veterans would spend hours at his enclosure, speaking to him in Polish, telling him news about other members of the unit, sharing memories of their time together. They brought him treats that keepers approved, fruits, vegetables, occasionally beer or cigarettes in carefully controlled amounts. They brought photographs and would hold them up to show Wojtek, pointing at faces in the images, naming comrades who were now scattered across the world. The bear would watch intently, his eyes following their gestures, his attention focused completely on these men who were the only family he had ever known. Zoo staff observed these interactions with fascination and growing respect. They had never seen an animal respond to human visitors with such obvious recognition and emotional depth. Corporal Zakariewicz visited more frequently than most, making the journey from Glasgow every few weeks, despite his advancing age and limited funds. He had found work in a textile factory, hard physical labor that left him exhausted, but he never missed a scheduled visit to Edinburgh. His wife, a Scottish woman he had married in 1948, understood the importance of these trips and supported them even when money was tight. Zakariewicz would sit by Wojtek's enclosure for hours, speaking softly in Polish, reminding the bear of their time together, of the mountains in Iran, the beaches in Palestine, the battlefields in Italy. He told Wojtek about his life in Glasgow, about his children who had never known Poland, about other veterans who asked about the bear whenever they met. The zoo staff learned to recognize him and would sometimes allow him closer access, understanding that this relationship transcended the normal visitor-animal dynamic. On special occasions, they would permit him to enter the enclosure itself, to sit beside Wojtek, to embrace the massive animal who would rest his head on Zakariewicz's shoulder like he had when he was a cub. Other veterans came less often as years passed, as their own lives filled with work and family, as memories of the war became something they tried to forget rather than remember. But Zakariewicz kept coming, driven by a loyalty that war had forged and peace could not break. The years passed slowly for Wojtek. The Edinburgh Zoo treated him well, providing regular meals and medical care, but captivity diminished him in ways that were painful to witness. The powerful bear who had carried artillery shells through combat became a sluggish animal who slept most of the day. He stopped interacting with other bears in adjacent enclosures. He showed little interest in the enrichment activities that zookeepers provided. Only when his old soldiers visited did something of his former self emerge. Then he would stand tall, would engage, would remember. Those moments became less frequent as the veterans aged and died. Zakariewicz passed away in 1961, his final visit to Wojtek occurring just weeks before his death. According to his family, he spoke about the bear constantly in his last days, reliving memories of their time together as if they had just happened. Wojtek died in December 1963 at the age of 21. The cause was natural old age, his heart simply giving out during sleep. The Edinburgh Zoo announced his passing in a brief statement, noting that he had been one of their most beloved residents. Polish newspapers ran obituaries, remembering the soldier bear who had become a symbol of Polish courage during the darkest days of World War II. Former members of the Second Corps held memorial services in Polish churches and community centers across Britain and North America. They shared stories about the bear who had been their brother in arms, who had faced death alongside them, who had reminded them that even in war, innocence and loyalty could survive. Some of these men wept openly, grieving not just for a bear, but for everything he represented: lost youth, lost homeland, lost comrades who had not survived to see peace. In the decades following Wojtek's death, his legend grew. Books were written about him, documentaries produced, monuments erected. In Edinburgh, a statue was unveiled in 2015 showing Wojtek standing upright beside a Polish soldier, both figures looking toward the horizon with expressions of determination and hope. The bronze sculpture captured something essential about their relationship, the way these two unlikely companions had supported each other through impossible circumstances. Similar memorials appeared in Poland, where Wojtek had never actually been, but where he was remembered as a symbol of Polish courage and resilience. In Krakow, a monument showed the bear carrying an artillery shell, commemorating his service at Monte Cassino. In Warsaw, his image appeared in exhibitions about the Polish Second Corps, educating new generations about the soldiers who had fought for a country they could not return to. Canada erected memorials in cities where Polish veterans had settled after the war, places like Toronto and Ottawa, where aging soldiers gathered to remember their service. These monuments became focal points for annual commemorations on anniversaries of Monte Cassino, where veterans who could still walk would assemble in their old uniforms, medals gleaming on their chests to honor fallen comrades, and to tell stories about the bear who had fought alongside them. Younger generations, children and grandchildren of these veterans, learned about Wojtek as part of their family histories, understanding that their grandfather's generation had lived through events almost too extraordinary to believe. Schools taught children about the bear who became a soldier, using his story to illustrate themes of loyalty, courage, and the bonds that form between unlikely companions. Teachers found that students responded powerfully to Wojtek's story, that it made the abstract horror of World War II concrete and accessible in a way that statistics about casualties could not. Children understood what it meant to care for an animal, to protect something vulnerable, to find friendship in unexpected places. Through Wojtek's story, they could begin to comprehend the emotional reality of war, the way soldiers had to maintain their humanity in circumstances designed to destroy it. Historians debated his significance, some dismissing him as a curiosity, a footnote to the real history of the Italian campaign. Others argued that he represented something profound about the human capacity to find hope in darkness, to create family from circumstance, to honor commitments even when doing so served no practical purpose. Academic papers were written analyzing Wojtek's role as a mascot and morale booster, comparing him to other military animals throughout history. But these scholarly discussions often missed the point that the veterans themselves understood instinctively. Wojtek mattered not because he was useful, though he had been useful at Monte Cassino. He mattered because he was loved, because caring for him had given broken men a reason to stay human, to preserve something good in a world consumed by evil. But perhaps the simplest truth about Wojtek was spoken by an aging veteran during a television interview in the 1980s. The old man, barely able to see through thick glasses, his hands shaking with palsy, spoke slowly but with absolute conviction. We needed him more than he needed us. We were broken men, defeated, exiled, fighting for a country we could not return to. Wojtek gave us something to protect, something that depended on us, something that reminded us we were still human. When we fought at Monte Cassino, we fought for Poland, but we also fought so that Bear could live, so that something innocent could survive this war. If we had failed, if we had died on those slopes, what would have happened to him? So we carried on. We climbed that mountain. We won. And Wojtek stood with us at the top, covered in dust, calmly eating a cigarette like it was just another day. That image, that moment, that is what I remember when I think about the war. Not the death, not the fear, but the bear, standing among the ruins, still alive. That was victory. Today, more than 8 decades after a young Iranian boy brought a bear cub to a refugee camp, Wojtek's story continues to resonate. It speaks to universal themes that transcend nationality and time. The power of compassion in the midst of violence, the strength found in unexpected friendships, the resilience of those who refuse to surrender their humanity, even when every rational calculation suggests they should. The soldiers who adopted a stupid bear cub could not have known they were creating a legend. They were simply trying to survive, to hold on to something good in a world that had become incomprehensibly cruel. In doing so, they gave the world a story worth remembering, a reminder that even in the darkest hours of human history, hope can take the most unexpected forms. Sometimes it wears a uniform and carries a rifle. And sometimes it stands 6 feet tall, covered in brown fur, saluting with a raised paw, ready to carry one more shell, to fight one more day, to be exactly what desperate men needed. A soldier, a friend, a brother.